purpose of this tutorial is to teach people how to use Adobe Photoshop to create sections and jumps for Supercross tracks using the gradient tool and the airbrush tool. Let me start by bringing up Photoshop. I've already got my gradient loaded from white to black to once again illustrate how color or brightness in grayscale is used to represent height points within our height field. To get consistent results, we're going to have to establish some standards that we'll use whenever we create pieces that we want to add into our Supercross track when displaced at a given strength to get always get the same results in the height. So what I'm going to do is, we have color ranges from 0 to 255. We're going to displace that consistently in Armadillo at a strength of 25. So a RGB value of 255 is going to equate to 25 feet tall. RGB value of 128, which is right in the middle, is going to be roughly 12.5 feet tall. And of course, black at 0 will be 0 feet tall. But we want to leave ourselves some leeway when we decide the darkest and the brightest values that we want to use in the editor, such that if later on we decide we need to make something slightly higher or slightly lower than extents that we defined as a baseline, then we'll still have some room to go without running out of color space. So what I'm going to do is establish that the ground level will always be at about 10% of the brightness scale, or RGB 25. So RGB 25 is effectively where our ground plane is at, and we're going to use all the way up to 90% of the overall gradient. So it's 255 minus 25 as the point at the top where our brightest colors are going to be. So let me close this. First thing we want to do whenever creating a new displacement map is create a new target file, or in my case I use PSDs a lot because I use a lot of layers when I'm doing things. But to make what ultimately will become a 257 by 257 24-bit target file, I always paint higher resolution. So let's start out with a 512 by 512 map. And it's important to note that the mode that you use is RGB color, not grayscale. Understand that we're painting grayscale data into our RGB image, but the Armadillo editor expects a 24-bit image to be read in. Grayscale images are actually 8-bit images. And so we'll start with the RGB 24 image that's 512 by 512. So there's our image. You can see we're only at 66.7% zoom, so let's zoom in one step so that we can see the entire image. Tab, of course, turns on and off the controls in Photoshop. The first thing we want to do is get our ground to be at our ground level color. So I'll click here and I'll type in, I want a brightness value of 10%. You can see that the R, the G, and the B are both are all at 25 there. Click the Fill tool. Now that we have the ground filled in at our base ground color, we can start using Photoshop's gradient editor to start creating individual sections. This is the gradient tool. If you double click on it, the toolbar over here will switch to the gradient tool menu options. And here's the edit button. In order to understand how to build good sections using the gradient tool, I need to explain how this section of the gradient tool editor works. The way it works is this F here stands for foreground color, which relates to this right here. The B equals the background color, and we actually don't use those at all. But you can never have fewer than 2 points out here, so in order to start putting more points out, in order to delete these two, we have to add some. So let's click on this random one on the left here, put 2 points out there. Now we can go ahead and drag these down, and that's how you delete them. You click and hold and drag down, it'll be deleted. But you can never have less than 2 out there. So if I drag down now, I can't delete the third one. So we'll slide these points to the end. What this represents, this is the beginning of our gradient and the end of our gradient. And each of these nodes that we put out here represent the color along the gradient that we want the gradient to be at that position. So I added a third node here. To change the color of a node, select it, click on the color value here, and we can see that the beginning is already at 10, so it's going to be RGB 25, 25, 25. You want the lowest point in each of the jumps in your section to match the altitude of your ground level. So check the other end one, make sure it's at 25, 25, 25. Now we click on the middle one, click on the color. You can either just run this circle up and down the left side here. Make sure you drag all the way to the far left to keep the color completely gray. Otherwise, some color will start bleeding into your grayscale value. So let's make this first test the simplest. Let's just make a giant mound that goes all the way up to about 90%. So here we'll type in 90 right there. So now you can see we have a gradient that goes from near black, near white, back to near black again. So we'll use this extremely simple example as the first section that we'll actually lay out. You click OK. Now the question is, how do I get my gradient to be in a consistent area on the screen? For that we use the marquee tool. In order to get consistent spacing and sizing results, you need to set a marquee tool to be using fixed size. And different sections that you want to create can be different areas, different widths, and different heights. But if you're trying to create an entire section at a time, a section usually represents 2/3 to about 4/5 of either the length or the width of a track. So for our test, let's make this section 400 pixels across. Remember that our image is 512 by 512 across, but we're going to scale that down to 257 by 257 by the time we bring it into the editor. So let's make it 400 by 50 across. Enter. Now, whenever we click a marquee out, we'll always get a marquee exactly the same dimensions. Getting the marquee to be the exact same dimensions every time is very important if you want the height and the scale of your jumps to turn out. Remember, color is relative to height in the editor. So we make that, select the marquee, hit Tab to turn off the control panel, put the cursor right on the left side, hold down the Shift key, and then drag to the right. You'll get a perfectly straight line. It doesn't matter if the cursor goes above or below. As long as you hold Shift down, you'll get a consistent one. Drag it right to the end, let go, and there's our gradient. The only thing bad about what we have here is now if we zoom in, and I'm sure you guys watching this on streaming video, it's a big blurry mess anyway, but if I zoom way in, you can see that it has a very hard edge here. It's not very soft at all. Let me zoom back out and show you how we take care of that. Control D will deselect the area that you have, hit the marquee tool, go back and choose normal, and drag a marquee that's slightly bigger in all directions than the area of your gradient. Then what we do is we use the motion blur tool. Go Filter, Blur, Motion Blur. First I set it to 0 degrees at a pixel strength of approximately 10 and do a blur, and then Filter, Blur, Motion Blur. Set it to 90, so now it's going to motion blur vertically instead of horizontally. And it's done. Now if we zoom in, you can see that we have a very nice blurry edge on the edge of our section, and it's going to translate to a very smooth wall in the editor. You will get jaggies or unsmooth terrain. Likewise, our gradient is very smooth this way, going from our ground color up to the highest value. So before we bring that into the editor, let's build one more section, and we'll try and build a triple jump. And I'm doing this completely blind, so it usually takes me a couple trial and error to get the size, the spacing, the strength of my jumps down to where it actually works good with the physics in the game. And so that's where the editor kind of becomes the game in and of itself. So let's go back to the gradient editor, click the edit button, and these controls over here are very handy too. They allow you to create new gradients, to load and save them to disk, which is a very handy thing. I actually have a collection of sections that I've made, triple jumps, tabletops, rhythm sections, whoop sections. Once you create a gradient and you're really happy with the results, you can save that out to a GRD file, which is the extension Photoshop uses for saved gradients. So let's click New, and we'll name this Triple Section Number 1. Okay, get our edge color set up properly. It's at 10. That's at 10. Let's start adding the points that we need to make a triple. There's the first jump, 3 more to make the second jump, and 2 more to make the third jump. Now we want to click the middle part of each little part of that aspect of the section, and let's run that up to about 75%. So that gives us RGBs of 191. When dealing in grayscale, I find it easier just to think in terms of color percentages from 0 to 100% and let Photoshop worry about the RGB values. So you can see now we've got a nice possible jump there. Click this one. Let's make the second section just a little bit lower. Let's make it only 70% strong. It'll be 5% lower than the other one. And then let's make our landing ramp equally high as the takeoff ramp. We'll put it at 75% also. Now, to adjust the shapes of the hills, you can drag each of these sections below here to give the hill shape. Now obviously we want our takeoff ramp to have a steep incline and then a pretty smooth decline on the back side. So you're going to want to move this to weight it a little bit towards the first one to make that a steeper hill. Likewise, our landing ramp, we're going to want to be nice and smooth on the back side. This is given that we're going to be traversing this section from left to right going across the screen. So this is the takeoff jump on the triple, and this is the landing jump for the triple. So let's move these sections out, get the jumps widened out a bit. This middle one will make it just about even, so if you flub the first part, you can just double into here and then step out of the section. So that looks pretty good, just guesstimating how things are going to be. You might be wondering what these little diamonds are floating above each section. What those are represent the midpoint between each of these points in the gradient. For example, if this point is at 10% brightness and this point's at 75% brightness, and this point represents a brightness value halfway in between. Now you can move that, you can select it, and you can either drag it side to side, and it's impossible to see how blurry this is, but right in through here it says location, and it has a percentage where this is 0% of the way through the gradient, and this is 100% of the way through the gradient. What you can do, if you want the shape of the incline of this to be a concave shape, in other words, it's bowl-shaped, so as you ride into it, right where you get to the top of the hill, it gets steeper. Move this closer to the top of the jump than the beginning of the jump. If you move this closer to the beginning of the jump, it's going to make your shape convex, and it's going to be very difficult to get preload off that hill, as the ground will actually start to fall away from you as you approach the top of the hill, rather than get steeper as you approach the top of the hill. So I find that having this between each point at roughly 50 to 60% of the way between those 2 points will give you the best results. So now that we're done, we can click the Save button, and we can save this as triple section 01. So that's saved out. Later we can start a new document, load that up, and still get access to our section. So we'll click OK. Select the marquee tool, fixed size, which we still have at 400 by 50. Hit the tab key to get those controls out of our way. Put our section out there. Hit the gradient tool. Click at the beginning, hold the shift key down, drag across there, and there's our triple. Once again, it's very hard edge. Hit marquee tool, say normal. Not quite big enough. So drag an area out around it. Filter, blur, motion blur, 0 degrees. And filter, blur, motion blur at 90 degrees. Now once again, you can see our sections now have nice blurry edges on them. So now that we've done that, let's take our displacement map into Armadillo and see what it's looking like. Keeping in mind that we've painted our image at 512, we want it to go into the editor at 257. So we need to say image, image size, scale it to 257 by 257, and save a copy. Keep it in our displace maps folder as a target file, and I'll call it sectionscopy.tga. Alrighty, now let's Alt-Tab into the editor and bring in our displacement. Sections copy. Okay, so now that's brought in. We've got our displacement set to 20. Let's run that up to 25. Now it's very important that once you settle on a displacement strength, if you're trying to build a group of sections that are intended to be linked together later, you have to displace things at the same strength, or when you bring sections in that were displaced at different strengths, it's very challenging to get them all to line up at a single displacement strength. So set a standard and use it. Remember, our standard for the ground was making ground at 10% of RGB. The highest point we were going to use to leave ourselves some headroom was 90% RGB on the brightest, and we're going to keep the displacement strength set to 25. So if things are coming in too tall, rather than change the displacement strength later, we need to edit our gradients in Photoshop and make them not be quite so bright. So now we can project it in 3D and just quickly test drive our bike on this section to see what the scale of our jumps are. I'm guessing that given that this one triple is almost the entire width of a supercross track, it's going to be monumentally huge and just about impossible to jump. But we can drive on to give you a graphical illustration of how your 2D stuff comes in. Now see, the sky is messed up. Anytime you Alt-Tab out of the track editor, when you come back in, the sky is broken. But if you just simply click a sky, and you don't need to, it's just kind of an annoyance that it's like that. But let's click the test drive button, drop the bike down there, let's pull the camera out. You can now see our jumps. Very important to notice that our jumps are all perfectly smooth. When we ride up them, there's nothing uneven or bumpy about them at all. So it's turn. Yep, see, it can't even hardly make our double jump here. So definitely the section that we built is way too huge, but it illustrates the points of how to make smooth inclines and declines. You can see how the side bleeds out nicely to our base elevation using the result of using the motion blur there in Photoshop. So this big mound, we can just drive up it. You can see it smoothly curves to the apex and then begins flowing back down to our base elevation. Let's run out here and just get some huge speed. It's impossible to tell how fast you're going without the good texture. And hit that. Oh yeah, that's a crazy jump. And you guys think you should survive that. Anyway, let's go back out and let's make one more section. Let's make a whoop section, bring that in, and that will conclude today's lesson on using the gradient tool. Hit escape, alt-tab back out. Okay, hit the gradient tool, hit edit, click new. We'll name this Whoops 01. So let's start clicking out some points. Remember, we need 3 points to make a hill. So we got 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So and continue clicking out and to get all your points all the way across. Space them out the way you like. One too many points there. Now we need to go through and raise each of the middle ones. So whoops should be very low. If our base altitude is 10, let's try making each of these whoops 20 high. So the third one, 1, 2, 3, and coming up on the last one here. Now, I made each of these exactly 20 tall. You can always make your whoop sections uneven. Go back and randomly pick them and make some 1 or 2%, like let's make this one 22%, and let's skip a couple over and then make this one 19%, so that our whoops won't all be evenly elevated. Likewise, you can move each of these so that your whoops aren't evenly spaced. Now, if you look at this, obviously there's way too much distance in between here. I put fewer points than I typically do when I'm working on a VGA monitor because my output's going to television, so I can make this video for you. So it's going to make a pretty silly whoop section. We never space it quite that way. But getting each section to be the height and the angles that you want can be just the basis for what you're doing later on. Initial spacing of your whoops can just be a starting point. You can always edit what you've done later. So let's get our fixed size marquee out there. Click that out again. And let's change this. Let's do our whoop section in only 300 pixels across instead of 400. So let's put our marquee out. I've set it to only be 300 pixels by 50 across. Grab the gradient tool, shift-click across there, and bang, we've got our gradient. Once again, let's set the normal marquee. Make my area a little bigger than where my stuff is at, so I can motion blur it nicely. Filter blur, motion blur 0, and filter blur, motion blur 90. Now if we zoom in, you can see that we've got a nice little whoop section. So, of course, if you don't like the spacing, you could always edit things manually. Just make sure your background color is set to the color that matches your ground altitude. Start making marquee selections and moving pieces in. So I can drag those a few closer. Grab this one. It's nice in Photoshop you can use the arrow keys once you've created a selection to move things around. Tap the V key to get it into the move mode. Okay, so you can see how we can edit the spacing of our whoop section. So once again, let's save it. 257. Save a copy. Sections copy. Replace it, yes, 24-bit. And then you always want to remember to undo your image size that you did, lest you forget and accidentally save over it. Let's Alt-Tab back into the editor and bring our displacement in again. Use the reload button, which is real handy there. And convert it into 3D. Let's take one last look at our new sections. And I think you guys will have a good understanding of how you can start painting your own sections using the gradient tool. Okay, so here's our whoops. And yeah, they turned out too big, and they look really goofy without any texture mapping on them. But let's drive down to the end where I edited them, spaced them together a little more. Yeah, see, so it looks like we might want to have considered making them just a little bit stronger. So we just go back, edit our gradient, click on the center point for each of those covers. Instead of making them like 20% brightness, maybe 25 or 27% brightness would be a little better. So, very important thing, understanding all this now gives you the ability to, in Photoshop, create pre-made double jumps, sections, step-ups, tabletops, whoops, and type of sections that you can imagine, and then keep those as building blocks that you can later just use to piece together new tracks using various layouts and things like that. Likewise, you can use the airbrush, which we didn't get into today, to create bermed corners, which once you've created a few corners that you really like, you just keep a library of those available so that building tracks, at least for Supercross, can become mostly a cut and paste process. So that concludes this lesson.